What if the most dangerous person in your life isn't your enemy, but someone you trust completely? Imagine this. You know someone. This person smiles at you when you need them. They say the right things at the right time. You feel understood. You feel seen. And then, at some point, without you even realizing it, everything revolves around this one person. Your world has slowly shifted, and you didn't see it coming. This is dark psychology. Not a myth, not an exaggeration, but a technique, a system, and it's used every day in relationships, at work, in friendships, in politics, in advertising. Once you understand how this system works, you'll never see people the same way again. Not because you'll become suspicious, but because you'll see more clearly. Dark psychology is a term that has gained increasing attention in recent years. But what does it really mean? Many people immediately think of thriller movies, serial killers, extreme cases, but that's a mistake. Dark psychology isn't a fringe phenomenon. We encounter it in everyday life, in perfectly ordinary people, in perfectly ordinary situations. At its core, it's about this. Every person has the ability to influence others. That's normal. That's human. We all try to shape our environment, build relationships, achieve our goals. The crucial difference lies in the how and the why. People who use dark psychology deliberately employ psychological techniques to control, manipulate, or harm others, often without remorse, often without empathy, and often so subtly that the victim doesn't even notice. And that's precisely what makes it so dangerous. Think about it. If someone wants to harm you physically, you'll see it. You can protect yourself. You can run away. But if someone uses psychological tactics, then you often see nothing. You might only feel a vague unease that you can't quite put your finger on, a feeling that something isn't right, but you don't know what. And while you're still trying to figure it out, the manipulation continues. Your brain is tricking you, but not always you, your own brain. Sometimes someone else is doing it for you. To truly understand dark psychology, we first need to understand what we're actually dealing with. Psychologists have spent decades researching which personality traits are associated with manipulative, callous, and exploitative behavior. In doing so, they've come across a pattern they call the dark triad. The dark triad describes 3 personality dimensions that often occur together and form the basis of dark psychological behavior. The first element is narcissism. A narcissist, in the sense that psychologists use the term, isn't simply someone who takes a lot of selfies or thinks they're attractive. Narcissism, in its clinically relevant form, goes deeper. It's an exaggerated sense of self-importance, an insatiable need for admiration, and a fundamental inability to empathize with others. A narcissist doesn't see other people as equals. They see them as resources, as mirrors meant to reflect their superiority, as tools to help them achieve their goals. And when someone no longer meets these expectations, they are discarded without scruples, without explanation. What if I told you that you've probably already encountered a narcissist? Not necessarily in the extreme sense, but people with narcissistic traits are far more prevalent in society than most people realize, and they are often exceptionally charming. That's no coincidence. Charm is their most important tool. The second element of the dark triad is Machiavellianism. The term comes from the Italian philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli, who wrote a book in the 16th century describing the art of political power. His core principle was simple: the end justifies the means. Machiavellians think this way. They are cold strategists. They can plan for the long term, manipulate and deceive others if it serves their goals, and show astonishingly little emotional reaction. They are not impulsive, they are methodical, and that is precisely what makes them so dangerous. A Machiavellian doesn't lose control. They always have it, and they are often planning steps ahead while you are still living in the present. The third element is psychopathy. This word immediately conjures up images of serial killers and horror movies for most people, but the reality is far more nuanced. Psychopathy describes a spectrum, and on this spectrum there are many people who function in society, have careers, maintain relationships, and yet ... systematically exploit others. What unites psychopaths is a profound indifference to the suffering of others, combined with often extraordinary charm and the ability to mimic emotions they don't truly feel. They can cry when necessary. They can smile when strategically advantageous. They are masters of performance. What these three traits have in common is this: they all lead to a person manipulating others, without remorse, without genuine compassion, and with terrifying effectiveness. Now, you might understand better what we're dealing with, but that's not enough, because the dark triad is the backdrop. What really concerns you are the specific techniques these people use, and there are many. Let's start with one of the best known and, at the same time, most misunderstood techniques: love bombing. Imagine you meet someone, perhaps romantically, perhaps just as a friend. From the very beginning, this person is exceptionally attentive. They text you every morning. She showers you with compliments that feel almost unbelievable. She calls you special, unique. She says things like, "I've never met anyone like you." It all happens very fast, very intensely, and at some point you feel intoxicated. You want more of that feeling. You're hooked. This is called love bombing, and it's not a declaration of love. It's a strategy. Your brain is the real target. When someone showers you with attention, praise, and affection, your brain releases dopamine, the same neurotransmitter that plays a role in addiction. You learn to associate this person with a feeling of euphoria. You need them, and when that intense beginning eventually cools down, and it always does with manipulators, you're already deep in. You try to recapture that earlier high. You adapt. You give more. You tolerate more. That was the plan. Another technique, particularly frightening in its subtlety, is called gaslighting. The term originates from an old British film from 1944, in which a husband systematically tries to make his wife believe she's crazy among other things, by dimming the gaslights in their house and claiming she's imagining it. Gaslighting is the systematic undermining of one's own perception. It sounds like this: "I never said that." Even if you know perfectly well it happened, you're overreacting. Even if your reaction is completely understandable, you're being too sensitive. Even if your feelings are justified, you're imagining Even if you're certain, what happens in your brain during this. Over time, these statements begin to take effect. You question your own memory. You begin to believe that you might actually be too sensitive. You apologize for things that aren't your fault. You no longer trust your own perception. And the less you trust yourself, the more you depend on the manipulator to tell you what really happened. Gaslighting is one of the most brutal forms of psychological manipulation, not because it's loud, but because it works so quietly. Then there's isolation. That sounds dramatic, but it rarely happens dramatically. It happens gradually. The manipulator comments on your friendships. You know, I think your friend X isn't a good influence on you. Or they make sure that time spent with other people is always fraught with conflict. Or they need your undivided attention precisely when you actually want to be with others. Over months, your social network dwindles. You barely notice it. And then one day when you really need help, when you need someone to tell you what they see, there's no one left. Just them. Isolation isn't accidental. It's a strategic move. A person who is isolated is a person who is dependent. Another technique is triangulation. This involves using a third-person real or imagined as a tool. My ex would never say that. My colleague understands me much better. Everyone else sees it the same way. The message behind this is clear. You're not good enough. You have to prove yourself. You have to push yourself. And while you're busy improving to win the comparison, you lose yourself. And then there's the technique that's perhaps the most effective, because it works so paradoxically. Intermittent reinforcement. What if I told you that unpredictability is more addictive than predictability? It sounds strange, but it's scientifically proven. Behaviorists, psychologists discovered as early as the 1950s that irregular rewards, sometimes yes, sometimes no, without any discernible pattern, are highly addictive. A pattern one that leads to stronger behavior than regular rewards. This applies to animals in the lab, and it applies to people in relationships. A manipulator who uses this, whether consciously or unconsciously, switches between warmth and coldness. Sometimes they are loving and attentive. Sometimes they completely ignore you. Sometimes they explode. Sometimes they are the gentlest person in the world. For no discernible reason, without a pattern, your brain goes into overdrive. It searches for control. It wants to understand what you have to do to get the warmth back. And in this state of insecurity, you are ready to give almost anything. Think about it. Have you ever experienced this? Or do you know someone who describes a relationship like this? There are other techniques, too. The so-called blame reversal, where the manipulator always makes sure you feel guilty even if they caused the problem. Suddenly, you find yourself justifying things you didn't do. The silent treatment, so known as the weapon of silence, where someone simply cuts off communication without explanation. No response to messages, no reaction, withdrawal of attention as punishment. And then there's the belittling, the creeping undermining of your self-esteem. Not through overt insults, but through subtle comments disguised as jokes, concern, or honest feedback. I'm only saying this because it's important to me. But the effect is clear. You become smaller. Why do all these techniques work so well? Why is it so hard to protect yourself? The answer lies in your biology. Your brain wasn't designed for the 21st century world. It was designed for a world where social bonds were essential for survival. Being in a group meant protection. Being alone meant danger. That's why your brain responds to social rejection with the same neural pathways it uses for physical pain. That's why your need for connection is so deep, so fundamental, so hard to ignore. Manipulators understand this consciously or instinctively, and they exploit it. Oxytocin is a neurotransmitter often referred to as the bonding hormone. It's released when we touch someone, when we make eye contact, when we laugh together. It makes us feel trust. It makes us feel safe. And that's wonderful in real, healthy relationships. But when someone deliberately creates situations that trigger oxytocin without genuine trust, this hormone becomes a trap. You trust someone because your body tells you you can trust them. But your body doesn't know that the signal has been manipulated. That's the terrifying part. Your brain, which normally protects you, is used against you in this case. Add to that something psychologists call the sunk cost effect. The more you've invested in a relationship, time, energy, emotions, maybe even money, the harder it is to let go. Not because the relationship is good, but because you've already invested so much. You tell yourself it has to be worth it eventually. Manipulators know this. That's why toxic relationships often last so long. And then there's the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance. When two beliefs within you clash, for example, I love this person and this person treats me badly. An unpleasant, inner tension. Your brain wants to resolve this conflict, and it often chooses the easier path. It rationalizes away the bad behavior. He was having a bad day. She doesn't mean it. It's my fault. Not because you're weak, but because your brain is seeking peace. This is the moment when outsiders shake their heads and say, "Why don't you leave him?" And from the inside, it feels like the most impossible question in the world. Now let's look at how you can recognize manipulation early on, because recognition is the first and most important step. The first warning sign is a connection that intensifies abnormally quickly. If someone tries to build a very deep intimacy in a short time, if everything feels very intense very quickly, if you feel like you've known this person forever, even though you barely know each other, that's a signal, not a coincidence. True depth takes time. It develops through shared experiences, through challenges overcome together, through slowly getting to know one another. If someone simulates this depth without having invested the time, something is wrong. The second warning: sin is a lack of accountability. Observe how someone deals with mistakes. Their own mistakes. If someone can never admit to being wrong, if every mistake is blamed on external circumstances or other people, if the ability to apologize is completely absent, then I tell you, that's no by chance. People who lack accountability are the same. People who will one day hold you responsible for their mistakes. The third warning sign is what I call the hot-cold cycle. If you notice someone's affection for you fluctuates unpredictably for no apparent reason, pay attention. This could be intermittent reinforcement. This could be a tool to keep you in a state of uncertainty. Healthy relationships, of course, have their ups and downs, but the difference lies in the pattern. Extreme warmth followed by extreme cold. Followed by extreme warmth, That's not a normal pattern. That's control. The fourth warning sign is when you regularly feel worse after talking to someone. This sounds simple, but it's often overlooked. Ask yourself, when I met this person, did I usually feel better or worse afterward? Was I inspired or was I exhausted?
I leave the conversation
with more energy or less? Manipulation is often draining for the victim because it requires constant adaptation, constant self-justification, constant vigilance. That takes energy, and this exhaustion is a signal. The fifth warning sign is the isolation we've already discussed. If someone subtly or overtly questions your other relationships, makes them problematic, or causes you to spend less time with others, observe this very closely. A person who means well wants you to have a rich, connected life. A manipulator wants you to be dependent on them. The sixth warning sign is the feeling that you constantly have to prove yourself, that affection or recognition is always conditional, that you're never really good enough. In healthy relationships, you are loved and accepted for who you are, not because of your performance, not because of your adaptation. You are enough. If the opposite is true, ask yourself why. And the seventh warning sign is perhaps the most abstract, but also the deepest: your gut feeling. When you have a feeling that something isn't right, even though you can't put your finger on it. When you feel a vague unease for no apparent reason. When your body is telling you something your mind hasn't yet grasped. Listen, neuroscientists call these somatic markers, bodily reactions to social stimuli that contain information before your rational mind has had a chance to process it. Your body sometimes registers inconsistencies in microexpression, a discrepancy between words and behavior, a minimal change in tone of voice before you can consciously name them. This feels like discomfort, like a gut feeling. Don't ignore it. Now we come to what I believe is the most important part. How do you truly protect yourself? Protection doesn't begin with distrusting others. Protection begins with trusting yourself. That sounds simple, but it's deeper than it seems. Manipulators need a target. The more insecure you are about yourself, the larger that target becomes. The less you know about what you want and who you are, the easier it is to let others define who you should be. Self-knowledge is the first and most fundamental protective strategy. What are your core values? What is absolutely non-negotiable? For you, in a relationship, which of your needs are so fundamental that someone who consistently ignores them shouldn't have a place in your life? If you can answer these questions clearly, you'll recognize more quickly when someone is testing these boundaries. And manipulators test boundaries. Always. The second strategy is to earn trust, not to give it freely. In our culture, there's sometimes the idea that openness and trust are virtuous, that it's a good thing to trust someone immediately. And in a sense, that's true. Basic goodwill toward other people is valuable. But deep trust, the trust that allows someone to get close to your life, your thoughts, your vulnerability, must be earned. Through time, through consistency, through actions that match words, not just nice words. The third strategy is managing boundaries. A boundary isn't a wall. It's clear communication about what's acceptable to you and what isn't. Bounded boundaries don't just protect you from others. They tell others how to interact with you, and they reveal who someone really is. A person who responds to a clearly communicated boundary by respecting it tells you something about their character. A person who responds to a clearly communicated boundary by arguing, downplaying, or ignoring it also tells you something about their character. Listen. The fourth strategy is preserving your ... social network. Friendships and family aren't just nice, they're a shield. They give you outside perspectives. They see things you might miss when you're too close. They remind you who you really are when you start to lose yourself. Protect these connections, nurture them, and be wary of anyone who questions them. The fifth strategy is what I call the consistency check. People reveal themselves through behavior over time, not words. Observe whether what someone says matches what they do. Not once, not twice, over months. Manipulators are often very good at saying the right thing, but over time, inconsistencies emerge. Behavior that doesn't match the words, promises that aren't kept, apologies that aren't followed by a change in behavior. You only see these patterns if you observe long-term, dispassionately, without the rose-tinted glasses of a first impression. The sixth strategy is emotional regulation. This sounds technical, but it's fundamental. When we're caught in strong emotions, infatuation, fear, guilt, our ability to make clear judgments is impaired. Manipulators know this. That's why they often create situations where you're emotionally overwhelmed before demanding important decisions from you. If you really love me, then ... In the context of an emotional escalation, learn to pause during charged moments. I need time to think about this. That's not a weakness, that's strength. And if someone denies you that pause, if they pressure, you too decide immediately. That in itself is a warning sign. The seventh strategy is seeking external perspectives, not because you should blindly trust others, but because isolation narrows your perception. If you tell someone you trust, a friend, a family member, perhaps even a therapist, about your situation and see how they react, you'll gain information, not always comfortable information, but important information. And the eighth strategy, perhaps the most fundamental of all, is self-compassion. Many people who end up in, or have ended up in, manipulative relationships tend to judge themselves harshly. How could I have been so naive? I should have seen it coming. But that's wrong. You are not naive. You have the capacity to trust. You have the capacity to connect. These are not weaknesses. They are deeply human qualities. Manipulators exploit them, but that doesn't make these qualities wrong. It makes the manipulator's behavior wrong. If you recognize that you have been or are being manipulated, be gentle with yourself. Acknowledge it, name it, and then act. What if I told you that knowing about dark psychology isn't depressing, it's liberating? Many people who really delve into this topic for the first time initially feel uneasy, a kind of dizziness, the feeling that the world isn't as safe as it used to be. But the opposite is true. The more you understand, the clearer you become. Dark psychology loses its power the moment you see it. A trick that's exposed is no longer a trick. A technique that you recognize loses its effectiveness. You won't become paranoid. You won't become cynical. You'll become clearer. You'll become freer. There's a famous quote by the philosopher Epictetus. It is not things that disturb us, but our opinions about things. In that sense, it's not the manipulators who harm us the most. It's the lack of knowledge, the ignorance of what's happening. That's what's dangerous. If you know what love bombing is, you'll recognize it sooner. If you know what gaslighting is, you'll stop doubting yourself. If you know how isolation works, you'll cultivate your relationships more consciously. Knowledge protects you, not completely, not forever. No one is immune, but it gives you tools, and tools make all the difference. Think about it. You're not here because you're weak. You're here because you want to understand, because you want to see more clearly, because you want to understand yourself and the people around you better. That's no small thing. That's the beginning of everything. So is dark psychology really that dangerous? Yes, but only if you don't know about it. And now you know about it. A little better? That's not a bad start. Your brain sometimes tricks you. Others try to as well. But those who know the tricks can't be fooled so easily. Think about it.